Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at moral error theory, which was developed by J.L. Mackie. As you might remember from the first video, moral error theory claims that all moral statements are false. So it's a pretty radical claim. Mackie's basic argument is fairly simple. It goes, moral statements express beliefs about objective moral values, but there are no objective moral values, so all moral statements are false. Fairly simple argument. Moral statements claim that there is a certain thing in the world, there isn't that thing in the world, so they're all false. For Mackie, moral values are like witches, unicorns, phlogiston, or the luminiferous ether. Saying abortion is morally wrong is like saying Sarah put a curse on my cattle. There are no witches, there are no curses, and there is no moral wrongness. I suppose I should note actually that there technically is one class of moral statements that are not false. Those of the form X is not wrong, X is not right, X is not good, X is not bad, and so on. These are all true, because these are like saying Sarah is not a witch. Well, of course it's true that Sarah is not a witch, because there are no witches. I guess the one thing you have to be careful with here is that in standard discourse, if I say, for example, slavery is not permissible, this might be taken to mean that slavery is wrong, slavery is forbidden. Whereas Mackie would say, slavery is not permissible, slavery is not wrong, slavery is not forbidden, because it just has no moral properties at all, right? So all of those statements are fine. If you're saying something doesn't have a particular moral property, all those statements are true. But generally speaking, error theory basically says that our whole moral discourse is false. Okay, it's just wrong. So the moral error theorist has to defend two claims. First, the claim that moral statements express beliefs about objective moral values. That's the sort of conceptual element to it. And then second, the claim that there actually are no moral values. So that's the metaphysical claim. Alright, so Mackie says that moral statements include a claim to objectivity. Moral statements presuppose that moral values are objective. Now the first question here is, what exactly does it mean to say that something is objective? In his introduction to contemporary metaethics, Alex Miller lists something like 15 different ways that Mackie uses the word objective, so that's not very helpful. But what I'm going to say is that for something to be objective as opposed to subjective is for it to exist mind independently. So its existence and properties don't depend on what anybody thinks about it. It's a feature of the external world, like gravity, solidity, mass, and so on. So, for the error theorist then, when I say murder is wrong, I'm describing a mind-independent property of murder. Murder is wrong no matter what anybody thinks about it. Just like if I say the cup is solid, solidity is a mind-independent property of the cup. Right? Cups are solid no matter what anyone thinks about them. That's the way we usually conceive of cups anyway. Okay, so why should we assume that moral statements include a claim to objectivity? Well, first, moral statements have a certain kind of authority. If I'm talking about abortion and somebody says, I don't like abortion, there's a strong temptation to respond, well, so what? I mean, who cares if you don't like abortion? Why should that matter to me? On the other hand, if somebody says abortion is morally wrong, well, that seems to demand an argument in response. It seems to have greater weight. So we can see that we can sort of have these substantial moral disagreements and moral debates, whereas we can't really debate our personal tastes. Moral statements are meant to persuade in a way that statements like, I enjoy Frank Zappa, obviously aren't, right? If I say I enjoy Frank Zappa, I'm not trying to persuade anyone of anything, I'm just expressing my own views. So this suggests that when we make moral statements, we're relying on there being something outside of ourselves that backs them up, that gives them this authority. Mackie also points to the way that existentialists and similar philosophers have responded to the denial of objective values. He says, the denial of objective values can carry with it an extreme emotional reaction, a feeling that nothing matters at all, that life has lost its purpose. And actually this kind of reaction doesn't just happen with existentialists. Many people suggest that if values aren't objective, then life becomes meaningless, social order is threatened, and so on. So that suggests that people have been tending to objectify values. They've been tending to assume that values are external to us. Let me add one more argument here. This wasn't suggested by Mackey. It's adapted from a point made by Paul Benassaraf in interpreting mathematical statements, which I won't go into here, but I'll put a link in the video description. So, the problem with non-cognitivism and relativism and similar views is that they have to make an exception for moral language. Error theorists, by taking moral statements basically at face value, can give a uniform semantics for language. Now, by semantics, I just mean a general theory of meaning, truth, reference, and so on. So let's consider the statements, murder is wrong and the cup is solid. Now, there's an obvious prima facie similarity between these statements. Grammatically speaking, they have the same form. So take the cup is solid. What are we doing when we say the cup is solid? Well, we're saying there's a particular object, namely a cup, and it has a particular property, namely solidity. So this statement works by picking something out in the world and attributing a property to it. Okay, then there's murder is wrong. Now for the error theorist, explaining the semantics of this statement is no problem. Again, we're taking a particular thing in the world, murder, and attributing a property to it, wrongness. So this is of the same general form as our statement about the cup. Or take the bed is smaller than the room. Here we have two things in the world, and we're attributing a certain kind of relation to them, namely smaller than. With murder is worse than theft, for the error theorist, this takes two things in the world and attributes a certain kind of relation to them. Okay, so it's simple. It has the same kind of uniform semantic account. And the point is, we all agree how to interpret statements like the cup is solid and the bed is smaller than the room. The error theorist doesn't need to make special exceptions for moral statements. He treats moral statements in exactly the same way. But if you're a non-cognitivist or a subjectivist, you have to make exceptions for moral statements. You have to give a different, probably fairly counterintuitive account of each of them. For the non-cognitivist, moral statements aren't even true or false. I mean, they just have no truth value. And that's just a bit weird. I mean, that's very difficult to see how that works. For the subjectivist, moral statements are true or false, but in a way completely different to how other statements with the same grammatical form are true or false. So we have these. So there are these two options here. They're just a bit odd, really, basically. Whereas the error theorist has a far simpler approach. The error theorist's semantics is just much simpler. It's much more uniform. It's more satisfying in a way. I'll come back to this point about simplicity later, but I hope you can see how that works. Now, obviously, none of this is conclusive, and I'll probably talk about all of this a bit more in later videos. But I think we have to concede that it's fairly plausible that moral statements do presuppose objective values. But, according to Mackey, there are no objective values. Now, he has two arguments for this, which they're not great. They're not great in my opinion. But, well, let's look at them. First up is the argument from relativity. So there's a great deal of moral disagreement. Is there anything more horrific than infanticide? Suppose I take a newborn baby and leave it outside in the cold to die. I mean, most of us would say that there are a few, if any, crimes more terrible than this. But in ancient Greece and in many hunter-gatherer societies, infanticide was widely practiced. It wasn't seen to be a problem. So moral values differ very radically across different societies. And not just in different societies, but actually in different individuals in the very same society. Now, Mackey suggests that the best explanation for the radical differences in moral beliefs is that these beliefs arise from different ways of life or different attitudes, and not from sometimes faulty perceptions of objective values. Why is it the best explanation? Well, the objectivist has the problem of explaining why exactly do people go wrong. The objectivist holds that people perceive mind-independent values, but of course, some people perceive them better than others. So how is it that these perceptions go wrong? It just seems much more plausible that values aren't perceived at all, we construct them ourselves. They're just reactions that we have, and we're assuming that they're objective because we feel strongly about them. So an obvious response here is that there isn't just disagreement about morality. Across different societies, there are radical disagreements about all sorts of things: biology, psychology, cosmology, geography. But obviously, we wouldn't conclude that there are no objective facts about, cosmology. The sun is just one star among many. It's not a particularly big or special kind of star. Many societies have disagreed with that. Even our own society in the past disagreed with that. Is the best explanation for this that there are no objective facts about the sun? Unfortunately, this point, if anything, supports Mackey's argument, because we learn about cosmology through empirical investigation. We have particular reliable methods that we can use to study the world, and it was by applying these methods that we came to learn about the nature of the sun. And we can specify exactly where different people go wrong when they say that the sun and stars are completely different. We know why it was that we made those mistakes, and we know why it is that other societies make those mistakes. And furthermore, there's a fact that I mentioned in my last video, that two people can know almost everything there is to know about a subject, but still have very different moral views about it. I gave the example of abortion. Two people might know all the facts about abortion, yet one might say the fetus has a right to life that trumps everything else, the other might say the woman has a right to bodily autonomy that trumps everything else. There's a point at which moral disagreements just seem to be intractable. There are no facts we can appeal to that would lead people to change their minds. And this kind of intractability doesn't seem to happen with empirical facts. I mean, as long as all the participants in the debate are open-minded and are, willing to consider the evidence, then as we gather that evidence and develop our theories, we can come to some pretty secure conclusions about the nature of the world. But this doesn't seem to happen with morality. So that response maybe doesn't work. Another response, perhaps more plausible, is simply to deny that moral disagreement is as radical as Mackey suggests. There are certain things that are valued in just about every society. For example, you can't just go out to a random person and stab them in the face. In no society is killing random people acceptable. On a more everyday level, consider honesty. Lying is sometimes okay, but you can't go around lying all the time to everyone you meet. You're not going to be very popular if you do. So there are certain actions that basically everyone condemns, and there are certain character traits that basically everybody holds to be virtuous. Again, this response is questionable for two reasons. First, it means that what objective values there are is fairly limited. Okay, we all agree that honesty is good, but infanticide? If killing babies doesn't come out as objectively wrong, that's a pretty shoddy form of objectivism. And second, when we look at moral agreement, we find that it clusters around those things that have to be true for societies to function. So this suggests that what moral agreement there is simply a practical matter. There are certain things people have to agree on for society to exist at all. If we don't all agree that killing random innocent people is bad, then society is just going to collapse. Other things maybe are a result of our biology. We evolved to have certain reactions, certain responses. Again, there's no indication that any of this might have anything to do with finding the moral truth. Keep this point in mind, actually, because I'm going to come back to this later when we look at evolutionary debunking arguments. The point for now is simply that Mackey's argument is an appeal to the best explanation. He's saying that the best explanation for moral disagreement is that it arises from different ways of life, rather than from some people failing to perceive objective values correctly. And I don't think the fact that there's some moral agreement really makes much difference to this, because we can easily account for that moral agreement by pointing out the fact that we just have to have certain moral values. There are certain things we kind of have to agree on to have a society in the first place. Before we move on, I just want to note you have to be careful with the argument from relativity. The argument from relativity says that the best explanation for widespread moral disagreement is that moral values are not objective. But it's worth keeping in mind that even if everybody did agree about every moral issue, it wouldn't follow that moral values are objective. I'm just flagging this up because it's a confusion that I see often. Agreement does not imply objectivity. Objectivity is about mind independence. So even if everybody did agree on everything, it wouldn't necessarily follow that moral values are objective. Mackie's most famous argument is the argument from queerness. There are actually two arguments here, metaphysical and epistemological. Here's what Mackie says about metaphysics. If there were objective values, they would be entities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. So, what are moral values exactly? If moral values did exist, what would they be like? Well, pretty clearly, they're prescriptive as opposed to descriptive. So they tell us how things should be, not how things are. They tell us what we should do, not what we actually do. In this respect, they give us reasons to act or to refrain from action. If something's morally good, that's a reason to do it. If something's morally bad, that's a reason not to do it. Further, Mackie says, the prescriptions they give are categorical. This is based on a distinction drawn by Kant between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. So an imperative is a command or request. It's of the form, you should do such and such. Suppose I'm talking to a friend who's living a very unhealthy lifestyle, and I say to him, you should eat better, cut out the chocolate cakes, do more exercise. So those are imperatives. You should eat better, you should do more exercise. Now a hypothetical imperative is of the form, if you want X, then you should do Y. If you want to be healthy, then you should exercise. If you want to be a musician, then you should practice for at least an hour a day. If you want to get the 5 p.m. train, you should leave at 4:30, and so on. Now, hypothetical imperatives can, in a sense, be objective. If you want to be healthy, you should exercise. That's a fact. There are objective facts about how exercise affects the body. And if you want to reduce your chances of things like heart disease, we know, objectively, that exercise is going to help. Okay, exercise will reduce your chances of heart disease. But of course, if you don't care about being healthy, it may no longer be true that you should exercise. It's only when we agree to value health, then we can say you should exercise. But people can always release themselves from this imperative by saying, well, I'm not interested in health. We can't simply say you should exercise without qualifying it, because whether you should exercise is dependent on your goals and values. Somebody who just doesn't care isn't going to be that imperative isn't going to have any impact on them. Now, moral statements aren't like this. If I say torture is wrong, this means you shouldn't torture people. And you can't release yourself from this imperative. You can't say, well, I enjoy torturing people, or, well, I need to torture this person because I want to get information from him. You can't say anything like that. Morality is binding no matter what your desires or inclinations are. So you shouldn't torture people, and that's that. Morality is categorical. Morality issues categorical prescriptions. When I say torture is wrong, it's not a hypothetical like, if you want to be a nice person, you shouldn't torture people. It just means you shouldn't torture people, period. So to summarise, according to Mackie, moral statements are statements about objective, categorical prescriptions. Now maybe we can start to see just why Mackie takes these to be queer, to be bizarre. Where exactly do these fit into our picture of the world? Nothing in the world actually seems to contain these categorically prescriptive properties. It's difficult to make sense of what a prescriptive property that's completely independent of people's desires would even be like. There's something in the world saying do X. There's something in the world saying give to charity, or saying don't do Y, don't murder. I hope you can see why this is just weird. What things in the world have don't murder somehow built into them? This perhaps suggests why so many people tend to think that morality depends on God. You've probably heard theists make this kind of argument. If there is a God, then there is something out there saying do X, don't do Y. Actually, this still wouldn't be objective morality, since it wouldn't be mind independent. It would depend on God's mind. But at least in this case, we could make sense of morality being independent of our desires. If we say that morality is out there and doesn't depend on anybody's mind, it doesn't depend on what anybody wants, where do these do's and don'ts come from? As a corollary to the metaphysical argument, Mackey gives an epistemological argument. Since moral values are metaphysically queer, there's a big question about how, even if they did exist, we could possibly come to be aware of them. Mackey says, if we were aware of moral values, it would have to be by some special faculty of moral perception or intuition, utterly different from our ordinary ways of knowing everything else. So let's think about this. I mean, we don't access moral values through the senses. If you see one person stab another person to death, you don't see the wrongness like you can see the knife. You can't hear the wrongness like you hear the screams. Moral properties clearly can't be accessed through sense perception. Further, we don't get to them by conceptual analysis or by engaging in logical or mathematical deduction. It's not like you don't come to know murder is wrong like you come to know 1 + 1 = 2. It's clearly something very different going on there. And similarly, we don't get to them by framing hypotheses. So, for example, we can't see protons, but we know that protons exist because they play an important role in a highly successful physical theory. Moral values aren't like this. They don't seem to be theoretical entities like protons are. They don't seem to be part of very successful empirical theories. So, moral properties can't be accessed through sense perception, they can't be accessed through pure logical or mathematical reasoning, and they're not supported by being part of a successful theory. How then do we access moral values? It seems that the only way we could get to moral values, if they did exist, would be through some sort of special, uniquely moral faculty, which is unlike all our other faculties, and whose operation we have no clear understanding of. So, there's this big epistemological problem here for the objectivist. Now, these arguments, the metaphysical epistemological queerness arguments, they might strike you as fairly weak. I mean, after all, there are many things in the world that are strange, right? Consider quantum mechanics. There's all sorts of very weird things going on there. For example, the same particle existing in more than one place at the same time. Weird things like that. So the mere fact that something is weird is not a good reason to believe it. But of course, with things like quantum mechanics, we have a great deal of empirical evidence. Quantum mechanics is one of the most empirically successful theories ever developed, so it doesn't really matter that it's weird. We don't have empirical evidence for moral properties. Morality doesn't really seem to be a matter of empirical science. Or rather, we can employ empirical science once we've agreed on our values. So if we've agreed that we should maximise pleasure and minimise pain, if we've agreed that that's the moral thing to do, if we're sort of utilitarians, then it is an empirical matter how we go about this. But the values themselves, saying that it's morally good to maximise pleasure, aren't empirical. Of course, on the other hand, there are strange things where empirical evidence isn't so obvious. Mackey suggests that this is actually the best move for the objectivist. Look for companions in guilt, other things that kind of could be attacked by these queerness arguments that we believe in nevertheless. So, for example, modal properties. Modal properties are properties of necessity, possibility, contingency. We say that some things must be the case, some things cannot be the case. Some things might have been the case but aren't. There are ways things must have been, ways things could have been, ways things could not have been. There could not have been square circles, there could have been golden mountains, presumably. But what are these properties, exactly? These could have beens and could not have beens. Where do they exist? How do we come to know about them? Modal properties are really weird. How about numbers? Numbers are weird as well. I mean, I can hold up 3 fingers. I can have 3 cups. A house can have 3 windows. What about the number 3 itself? Where is that? What is it? How do we come to know about it? Or causation. It would take a long time to explain this, but if you've read any David Hume, you'll know there's a difficult question about what causation itself actually is. This list can go on for a long time. Okay, there are lots of weird things, which are not really a matter of empirical science, but they're things that most of us believe in. I mean, we all believe in modal properties, numbers, and causation. And yet these things are also metaphysically queer. And there's the corresponding epistemological problem. How do we come to know about modal properties, numbers, causation? So this seems to be the sort of best move for the objectivist, is look for other queer things, and that can kind of take some of the heat off the morally queer properties. Of course, this kind of response depends on us not being able to give perfectly sort of naturalistic, perfectly straightforward accounts of these other properties, of modal properties, numbers, causation. Mackie himself thinks, although he didn't explain this in his book, but he says that he thinks he can give very straightforward naturalistic accounts of all of these things. And he also adds that if there's anything which, if, for example, we weren't able to give a kind of naturalistic account of numbers, then actually numbers, we should reject them. Okay, they should be targets of the arguments from queerness as well. So, I mean, intuitions may differ on this point, but those were Mackie's arguments. Again, I'm not really sure that they're completely convincing. They sort of don't seem strong enough to warrant the fairly extreme conclusion that all moral statements are false. So let's consider just a couple more arguments. First, there's an argument from simplicity or parsimony. Generally, we prefer theories that are simple rather than complex and cumbersome. Other things being equal, simplicity is seen to be a theoretical virtue. Now, there are two important aspects of simplicity. First, there's ontological simplicity, which is summed up by the famous Occam's razor. Entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. Do not posit more kinds of things than you need to account for the phenomena. This kind of simplicity concerns what kinds of things we're saying exist. Next, there's theoretical simplicity. This is a bit more difficult, but essentially comes down to the number of hypotheses or principles of a theory. If a theory has to postulate all sorts of different laws, and it has to add loads of caveats to them, and it has to make loads of ad hoc hypotheses, then it has less theoretical simplicity. We want to make as few assumptions as possible. So don't multiply entities beyond necessity, it's ontological simplicity, and don't multiply assumptions and hypotheses beyond necessity, it's theoretical simplicity. Error theory seems to fare better than the alternatives on both counts. So regarding realism, it should be obvious. Realists have to posit a whole realm of mind-independent moral values. They have to suppose that there's some other kind of entity existing out there that the error theorist doesn't. So we have ontological simplicity. We've also seen that error theory is theoretically simpler than non-cognitivism and subjectivism and relativism, in that it can give a uniform semantics for moral and non-moral statements. It makes fewer sort of assumptions about the nature of language. It just has a simpler, more uniform semantics. It can give a uniform treatment of moral and non-moral arguments, moral statements in asserted contexts and unasserted contexts. So it doesn't sort of face the Frege-Geach problem, Jurgensen's dilemma, or anything like that. Error theory doesn't multiply theoretical assumptions. It has theoretical simplicity. Obviously, this argument rests on two fairly controversial assumptions. First, that simplicity actually is a theoretical virtue. There's been a lot of debate about this, which it would be kind of tangential to explore, but I'll put up a link in the description. Generally speaking, I think most people do agree that simplicity is important, but it's kind of debated just how much weight that should have, what its importance really is. And second, there's the assumption that other things are equal, because we say other things being equal, simple theories are to be preferred, but are other things equal here? Somebody who's a moral realist, for example, will probably insist that there are good reasons to be a moral realist. They'll say that moral realism actually accounts for the phenomena better than the error theory does. Error theory leaves things out. So, yes, moral realism is less simple, but the increased complexity is earned. We'll look at arguments for moral realism later. Just bear in mind that this appeal to simplicity only works if you think that error theory is as good an explanation in other ways as realism, non-cognitivism, subjectivism, basically all the other alternatives. But, those other alternatives have arguments in their favour. So again, this isn't this argument from simplicity it has some weaknesses. A very important argument for the error theory has been developed recently by Michael Ruse and Richard Joyce, the evolutionary debunking argument. There are many kinds of debunking argument. Here's the basic schema given by Guy Kahane, or Kahane, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. Anyway, the basic schema is S's belief that P is explained by X. X does not track truth, or X is an off-track process. So S's belief that P is unjustified. Right, so what's this idea of tracking truth? Well, there are many ways we might come to have a belief. There's a group of people who live in Africa known as the Azande. They were famously studied by the anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard. And they have some rather unusual ways of forming beliefs. They frequently use oracles. One of their oracles is to give chickens poison. So they'll ask a question, then poison the chicken, and if the chicken lives, it's a yes. If the chicken dies, it's a no. Actually, it's probably a bit more complicated than that. I'm, simplifying. But basically, they use, this poisoning the chicken to come to form their beliefs. They have all sorts of oracles, actually. They use them every day for all kinds of things. Anyway, suppose I'm planning on going out with a hunting party for a few days, and I want to know whether the weather will hold up, so we won't get caught by a storm or anything like that. So I poison a chicken, ask how the weather will be, and the chicken dies, which I take to mean that it's going to be bad weather. So I decide to stay home. We'll do the hunting party some other time. Now, it may well be that my belief is correct. Maybe a few days later, a big storm does indeed occur. But clearly, the belief is not really justified, because it's only accidentally correct. You can't really figure out whether a storm is coming by poisoning a chicken. What this means is that the Azande chicken oracle is an off-track process. It doesn't track the truth. If we find out that somebody has formed a belief through poisoning a chicken, then we have very good reason to suppose that their belief is unjustified. Because even if the belief is correct, it's only going to be accidentally correct, right? It's just an accident if it gets it right. On the other hand, consider sight. I've formed many beliefs through visual sense perception. I believe that I'm currently looking at a computer screen because I can see one right in front of me. Now, sight isn't perfect. We're subject to all sorts of illusions, hallucinations, so it's not 100% accurate. But generally speaking, sight is pretty good at tracking the truth. Beliefs that you formed as a result of opening your eyes and looking at things have a pretty good chance of being true. If I say I believe there's a computer in me, I believe there's a computer in front of me, and you ask me why, and I say, well, because I got my eyes open and I can see it, then unless we're in very unusual circumstances, that's a good justification for my belief. Right, so that's the distinction between processes that track truth and processes that don't track truth. Now, the evolutionary debunking argument first claims that our moral beliefs are a product of evolution. Moral beliefs confer evolutionary advantage because, for example, they help maintain social cohesion. Another way to run this argument would be sort of through sociology, a sociological debunking. Recall earlier when discussing Mackey's argument from relativity, I said that there are certain things that people have to agree on for society to exist at all. If we don't all agree that randomly killing innocent people is bad, society is just going to collapse. So if we didn't develop certain moral beliefs, either through evolution or just social pressures, society wouldn't be able to function, or at least it wouldn't function nearly as well. That's why we have moral beliefs. We have them because people who developed moral attitudes got on better than those who didn't, so were more likely to survive. Now, the crucial point for Joyce and Ruse is that this doesn't track the truth. It makes no difference whether murdering innocent people actually is wrong. Maybe murdering innocent people is wonderful. Maybe it's morally good to act like a horrible dickhead to everyone you meet. This has no impact whatsoever on the moral beliefs that people will actually develop. We have to believe that murder is wrong, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be here in the first place. Our society wouldn't have survived. So our moral beliefs are unjustified. Right? Our moral beliefs do not track the truth. It's very important to note that simply giving an evolutionary or sociological account of how we acquire some set of beliefs does not in itself show that those beliefs are false. In general, appealing to the origin of a belief doesn't show that the belief is false. Thinking this would be to commit an informal fallacy known as the genetic fallacy. I could say, for example, belief in God arose because of the fear of death. This may well be true, but it doesn't follow that the belief in God is unjustified. Perhaps people were afraid of death, but this led them to search for good reasons to believe in God. And if they have in fact come up with good reasons to believe in God, then belief in God may well be justified. So the moral error theorist's debunking argument needs to be sort of more subtle than just saying, well, this is how our moral beliefs arose. Now, Richard Joyce notes a contrast with mathematics, which this can maybe help show you how the debunking argument really kind of works, where its force comes from. So consider mathematics. It's arguable that our ability to think mathematically has an evolutionary history. Suppose we see 3 lions walk into a bush, and then we see 2 leave. Now clearly it's of great evolutionary benefit for us to be able to perform basic arithmetical operations. We need to know that there's still 1 lion in the bush. We need to know that 3 take 2 is 1. The people who have this capacity will be more likely to survive than the people who don't. So we can imagine that evolution has endowed us with this basic ability to do arithmetic. Now this doesn't lead us to suppose that our beliefs about mathematics are all false. But Joyce points out in this case, the beliefs need to track the truth. We need to be able to do the arithmetic correctly to get any benefit from it. If you think that 3 take 2 is 0, that's not going to help. 3 lions walk into the bush, only 2 come out. You need to know there's still 1 lion in there. So Joyce and Roos aren't saying that just because beliefs are a product of evolution, they're therefore unjustified. The question is whether the evolutionary benefit would come from those beliefs being true. Right? And if it wouldn't, if truth is of no relevance, then that casts the justification of those beliefs into question. So another example to see this would be with more aesthetic judgments, such as X is tasty or X is disgusting. Chocolate cake is tasty, rotting meat is disgusting. I'm assuming that nobody would say there are objective facts about whether something is tasty or disgusting. Indeed, even if there were objective facts about whether these things are tasty or disgusting, that would make no difference to our reactions to them. Chocolate cake is tasty to us because it's full of fat and sugar and other important things we need to survive that were once very scarce. Rotting meat is disgusting because it's full of bacteria that are dangerous to us and that will make us very ill. Any of our ancestors who didn't respond negatively to rotting meat would have died off before they had a chance to pass on their genes. Now, if we'd evolved from flies and maggots, we'd find rotting meat very appealing. So, there's no objective fact about whether something is tasty or disgusting. Or if there are objective facts, we have no access to them. So this is a good example of where our reactions to the world don't track the truth. It doesn't matter whether it's true or false that rotting meat is disgusting. We will find it disgusting because we have to find it disgusting to survive. Now, the claim made by philosophers like Roos and Joyce is that our moral beliefs are like our judgments of tastiness or disgust. Even if there were objective moral values, this would make very little difference to the moral views that we actually developed. Our moral views developed as they did due to evolutionary and social pressures. It was of enormous benefit for our ancestors to live in stable social groups. Humans are social creatures. We depend on other people. We've always lived in societies. So groups of people who had moral beliefs, such as murder is wrong, fairness is good, are going to fare much better than groups that had no moral beliefs. Unlike other animals, humans are not driven merely by instinct. We're not driven merely by our genes. We've developed capacities for rationality, reflective thought. We can initiate our own actions. So whereas other groups of animals will be held together because that's what their genes dictate, groups of humans needed to develop other ways of keeping behaviour in line. We don't stick together just because our genes, our instincts tell us to. Because we can overcome our genes and our instincts. So we need other processes, we need other things to control our behaviour. And that's sort of one way that morality developed, and it has nothing to do with truth. So hopefully you can see how that works. Our moral beliefs developed because of these evolutionary and social forces, but these processes don't track the truth. So that completely undercuts any justification we might have for our moral beliefs. That's the basic debunking argument. Now, this argument is obviously quite questionable. I think the main problem with it can be seen by considering something that at first might seem to support it. It's pointed out on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that Charles Darwin seemed to suggest an argument for moral skepticism. I'll link it in the box below. Anyway, Darwin says, imagine that bees developed rationality, intelligence, higher order thoughts, and so on. These kind of more complex cognitive processes that we have. Now, as they become more intelligent, they presumably develop systems of morality. But in their case, Darwin says, unmarried females would think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. Their moral beliefs would be unlike any that we find in any human society. So this at first might be taken to support the evolutionary debunking argument, because it suggests that morality arises from biology. Intelligent, rational beings have a very different biology to ours would also have a very different morality. And we can ask, whose morality is right? The intelligent bees who think that unmarried females have a duty to kill their brothers, or humans who generally don't like killing and who place a great deal of importance on loyalty to one's family? It looks like we kind of have to say that neither is right. It certainly would be difficult to justify saying that we're right and the bees are wrong. So, given that in both cases the moral framework is contingent on biology, how can we say that either moral framework tracks moral truth, right? It really looks like that undercuts our justification. But there's a problem here. There's a problem with taking this line of argument, because if bees did in fact develop intelligence and rationality just like ours, presumably there would also be groups of bees. There would be groups of bees who think it's fine for unmarried females to kill their brothers, but there would also be bees who question this. There would be bees who say, are these practices justified? Should we organise our society in this way, or should we build it on different principles? The bees would start to engage in criticism and argument. They would be able to resist the instincts that their genes had endowed them with. And this is something that humans appear to do as well. We don't simply follow what our genes tell us. In the distant past, morality tended to concern only the members of one's immediate tribe. And the obvious reason for this is that the immediate tribe was the main unit of social organisation. People outside the tribe didn't count. Okay? It just didn't matter. There was no kind of moral problem with them. And this attitude of people outside my tribe don't count has stayed with us, even as the sort of social units have gotten larger. So, as, for example, we started to live in kind of larger sort of cities, larger civilizations, the attitude was then, well, people outside the civilization don't count. A standard practice of many civilizations is war rape. If you were born in ancient Rome and you went into the army, you would probably have raped plenty of women from places that you'd invaded, and wouldn't have been a problem because they weren't Roman women, so who cares? But today we question this kind of attitude. Today we say, we have moral obligations to all people. And examples like this can be multiplied easily. Through reason and argument, we can ask whether the instincts that evolution has endowed us with are actually justified. And in some cases, we've come to say, no, they're not. So the response to the error theorist is, my moral views are not simply products of evolution or of the society in which I was born. I can engage in independent reasoning. I can come up with good reasons for accepting some moral views and good reasons for rejecting others. As for the concept of morality in general, the moral realist will say that he has good reasons for believing in objective morality. We'll look at some of those reasons in later videos. But it's obvious that moral realists aren't simply blindly accepting tradition. They're aware of the arguments against objective moral values. They think that those arguments fail, and they've come up with arguments for objective moral values. And it would be fairly ridiculous to assert that all of this debate is just a blind product of evolution or social tradition. So I guess it comes down to the point I mentioned earlier about, God. I mean, we can say if we want that, moral reactions originally emerged through evolution, but it's actually kind of difficult to see how this in itself shows that morality is unjustified, even if the processes that led to our developing moral reactions don't track the truth. So that's a questionable argument, I think. Okay, well, those were some arguments for the error theory. Now, before concluding this video, there's one more important question that we need to address. So error theorists say that all moral statements are false, and that leads to the question, what next? It seems that the natural response to this is to say that we just have to stop issuing moral statements. There are no such things as witches, unicorns, or phlogiston, so unless we're telling a fictional story or something, we shouldn't make statements that imply the existence of witches, unicorns, or phlogiston. But in fact, most error theorists don't want to go down this road. Most error theorists say that we can carry on making moral statements. Indeed, Mackey says that metaethical error theory doesn't make any difference to our normative ethical practices. Of course, there's something fairly uncomfortable about this. Consider talk about witches. We can imagine people debating exactly which people are witches. Can both men and women be witches, or is it limited to one gender? People might debate exactly how witchcraft arises. Is it a power people have from birth? Is it something people choose to develop? Does it arise due to interference from Satan? People can debate exactly what kinds of spells witches can cast. There might be lots of different theories about all these things. But we know that witches don't exist. There are no witches, so all of these theories must be rejected. It's pointless to ask what sorts of spells can witches cast, given that there are no witches and there are no spells. So why are we not in a similar position with morality? If all our moral judgments are false, how can we avoid the conclusion that we should simply stop making moral judgments? Well, the response here is that truth isn't the only value. Moral statements might not be true, but they can be useful in other ways. As I said, morality might be very useful as a way of maintaining social cohesion. Almost all of us value living in a stable society. We don't want to be wandering around minding our own business and then for someone to come up and stab us in the face. So moral discourse has this useful function that discourse about witches doesn't have. It doesn't really matter whether or not people talk about witches. Whereas it kind of does matter that people continue talking about morality. Morality makes a difference. Of course, there's still something kind of dodgy here. We might agree that morality has lots of benefits, but how could we have those benefits if we all came to believe that morality is uniformly false? In fact, we can still talk about witches. Sometimes people do talk about witches, where it's understood by all that they're engaging in fiction for one reason or another. But because we all know that it's fiction, it has no practical consequences. We don't act on this talk about witches. So the error theorist who says that morality is useful seems to be undercutting that use by expounding the error theory. By saying that morality is false, that seems to undercut whatever use morality might have. However, there is some reason to think that moral discourse can still have those benefits, even if we don't actually believe it. We can just pretend to believe it. We can engage in it as a fiction and it will still realise its benefits. Andrew Fisher quotes an interesting example from Richard Joyce. Suppose I want to start exercising regularly, but I'm very lazy. Very easily tempted, just to sit down and eat chocolate instead. It might help in this situation to come up with an unbreakable absolute rule. I must do 50 sit-ups a day. Now, as Joyce points out, it doesn't really matter if you do less than 50 a day, and you know that. If you do 47 on some days, that will work out just as well. But it's better to have a strong rule, a routine that you stick to. Joyce says, I do better if I encourage myself to think of 50 daily sit-ups as a non-negotiable value, as something I must do if I am ever to get fit. Or how about this? Tell yourself every day, I must do 50 sit-ups a day, or bad things will happen. Now, in fact, you know perfectly well that this isn't true. Your failing to do 50 sit-ups one day isn't going to cause bad things to happen. But if you tell yourself this, even if you don't really believe it, it can help motivate you. And you can see more problematic examples of this kind of thing in people with OCD. A person with OCD might say, I have to eat exactly 50 peas, because if I don't, bad things will happen. Now, what's interesting is that some people who have compulsive behaviours like these will know that they're irrational. They'll know that it's not actually true that bad things will happen just because they've eaten more or less than exactly 50p's. And yet they can't break the ritual. Maybe they have to eat the peas in some special kind of order. They have to split the peas up into groups of 5 and then eat exactly 50p's based on groups of 5. And some of these rituals can get very complicated. And many people with these kind of compulsive rituals will know that it's kind of silly. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't really matter whether they do the ritual or not, but they just can't help themselves. They can't break the ritual. So what this suggests is that we can educate people to think in moral terms. And even if they also come to believe that their moral judgments are uniformly false, this wouldn't necessarily have much impact on their behaviour. Moral discourse can retain the benefits of helping to maintain social cohesion, even if none of us really believe in it. We say it's good to help people in need, it's bad to murder, and so on. And these judgments motivate us, even if we know that they're false. Well, that's the idea, anyway. So that's moral error theory. Not something that I find completely persuasive, but I hope that made it make sense to you. I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video. I'm not sure what that's going to be about yet, but we'll be continuing that sometime soon. Alright, thanks for watching. Goodbye.